Good afternoon. This is the May 22nd meeting of the Town School Partnership Committee. This afternoon, we're going to be discussing budget issues that we're facing with this COVID-19 emergency and how we're going to dig our way through it. Starting off with discussion of the various deliberations of the school committee, the select board, and the advisory committee. The select board began discussions in some depth on Tuesday with respect to the town's financial situation, and we were presented with a number of options related to number of options that were policy related that we could take in order to address the upcoming fiscal year 21 situation. Those policy options will be also discussed at this meeting. At our next meeting this upcoming Tuesday, we will continue those discussions and maybe make some decisions with respect to the policy decisions that we can make, and maybe some other things. And this meeting of the Town School Partnership will inform the select board's meeting and our discussions at that time. So does the advisory committee have anything they would like to add?
Well, Bernard, do you want to talk a little bit about what the sort of topics we talked about were just a high level?
Yeah, well, and they're basically things that we're going to be discussing today. But we reviewed what cash is available from our reserves, from free cash, and other accounts that could be used from fiscal year 20 for fiscal year 21 expenses. We discussed some of the so-called untouchables, contractual obligations, such as collective bargaining and debt service. We discussed cost savings from things that the emergency has allowed us to not spend money on. A lot of things with respect to the schools that probably will be discussed by them. But we're not purchasing supplies, utilities, capital projects are not they are being deferred, and consultants and other expenditures that because of the emergency we don't have to make. We also discussed deferred maintenance issues and the balance that we have to recognize between savings from deferred maintenance and long-term costs of certain maintenances. Of course, we also discussed the use of pension payments as well as OPEB payments as possible sources of one-time revenues that we may want to tap, but of course recognizing that there are significant negatives to doing that. That's going to be a difficult discussion by the select board, as by all of us. So I mean, that's basically a high-level outline of what we discussed in our meeting on Tuesday, that we will continue in deliberations on this upcoming Tuesday.
We did make
Ben, did we?
Well, so we did make one revenue decision, and that was to increase some parking fees on commercial tenants for the residential parking permit, and then we voted to start to collect a daily permit fee for contractors who come to work on capital projects, both municipal and private projects.
Right. The consideration of those fee increases, I think, though, predated the COVID emergency. I mean, yeah.
My impression is they were proposed, but we actually voted to enact them in the new fiscal year. We did not vote on a trash fee increase or a meter rate increase.
Right. Okay. Mr. Sandman, you have anything to say?
Sure. After the last town school partnership meeting, we held a meeting of the advisory committee's subcommittee chairs, and we put together a list of recommendations that I believe you should all have seen, or at least almost all of you have seen. And I think that they paralleled the discussion that you had in the select board meeting. And I'll go very quickly through them. To look at our OPEB and pension contributions to see whether we should or can postpone some portion of those payments, so that or those allocations, so that we free up some cash that we otherwise wouldn't have. To look at some of the CIP projects that are fully funded, and instead look at borrowing a portion of those, the cost for those, to stretch the borrowing schedule for 10-year projects to 15 years, again, to preserve cash. We suggested postponing implementing VFAC's recommendation to move $2 million into the stabilization fund, and rather, funds are available, to use those funds in a reserve that is available for much more rapid use. Using money from the stabilization funds requires town meeting vote, 2/3 vote of town meeting. Whereas if we put them into the advisory, the funds that are available to the advisory committee, they're available basically with a request in a meeting. We suggested being cautious about allocating too much of the money that we can pull out as free cash to the operating budget, because we need to replenish reserves. And then we talked about we felt like there should be an agreed list of line items that would be the first things to be restored. If it appears that we can prudently release funds. Talked a little bit about property tax receipts and the possible need to finance a shortfall in receipts on a short-term basis for cash flow purposes. And we think it's really important to do some messaging. Brookline residents need to know what the dimensions of the problem is, and that and what the thinking of people in this room and the boards that we represent is. And we had some questions, and I won't go into those, but that was the summation of our recommendations, and hopefully we'll be able to grapple with some of those in this meeting.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone from the school committee would like to speak up? Julie, are you here?
I am here. So the school committee has had a number of meetings and discussions in trying to close our budget gap. Mary Ellen has some more information about where we're at. We have a lot of concern because we're getting very close to the end of the year and we still have a deficit. And so we've been having a number of conversations with, we've been having conversations with our unions, with employees, with vendors, with lessors, to try to find ways that we can close that gap. But that's where we're at right now.
Okay, Mr. Kleckner, would you like to start off with an update on federal and state funding issues?
Sure. So I have the agenda. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody, both participants and folks watching in. Town School Partnership is a sort of ad hoc committee. It's a public committee. It represents membership of the three major boards dealing with the budget: the select board, the school committee, and the advisory committee. And so we find these meetings really to be a good opportunity to facilitate conversation and discussion about budget issues primarily. And so we have an agenda for today, and the first item of the agenda was getting an update from the three boards, just see what they're up to and the issues they're dealing with. I'm going to move the federal funding down into some other updates, pretty soon in terms of the 21 revenue projection. But I think that my goals today are to really make sure that everyone understands what is in our initial budget, or I should say our revenue projection in our budget shortfall scenarios. We talked about them last week, but I really want to drill down a little bit. And if anybody has any questions or concerns about what's in the assumptions or what's not in, I think we really need to understand that, because that is what's driving our so-called $13 million budget hole. And then number three, I think, is the meat of the meeting today, is really to talk about some of these ideas. Go back to the agenda slide, please. Talking about all these issues in number three that Bernard and Mike alluded to. And really what I'm trying to see if we can reach today, or at least begin to discuss, is some consensus around an approach or a strategy that might consider using some of these sources of revenue, or amending our policies in order to smooth out or somehow spread out the pain, if you will. This is not going away anytime soon. I'm expecting fiscal 22 to be another difficult year. And so, I think we really need to look at this as a longer term, short term, but yet, short in nature, not permanent, but yet 2 years worth of an issue. And I really would like to have a discussion about how we might balance using some of these reserves, or changing our policies and cutting budgets, because I think we can't get away with that. But see if we might be able to figure a way to do that in a balanced approach over a 2-year period, and try to smooth our way out of this. And hopefully by the end of that period, of course, our revenues start to rebound. I think that's the way a lot of governments are thinking about this. We have very little time. That concerns me about the kind of implications that we're talking about in some of the budget reductions. We've had our departments do a budget scenario, and it's ugly. And I know it's ugly on the school side, some of the reductions, and they're happening so quickly that we really don't have a lot of time to evaluate them and communicate them to the public. Now, we'll have another opportunity to do that in November for this budget, but still, in terms of June, I'm thinking about a way to put a balanced approach together that tries to reduce that $13 million number somewhat to some level. We need to think about that. Whatever that number is, we have to allocate it between town and schools, and we again want to review our sort of pro rata share of the allocation, and then finally talk about timing and process. I really think we need to look at this fiscal 21 budget in 2 steps: the annual town meeting coming up, and then the November special town meeting, and then other business. So with that, I'm going to just move right into the presentation. And again, I wanted to really be clear. What's going on with the fiscal 21 budget? You know, we submitted our budget on February 15th. And so we're using that budget as sort of the base, and we're comparing what we're talking about now to that budget that was submitted in in February 15th. So let's talk about the major issues. The first is that we had $35 million projected in local receipts, and that included our override year 3 commitment that we would raise non-property tax revenue by around $2 million. So we're not only not being able to do that, but we're also having to reduce our overall local receipts by $9.4 million. That's a big chunk of that's the biggest chunk of our budget hole. That includes $750,000 worth of parking meter rate increases that we were included, but we're at this time, at least, we're not including it. And I thank Select Board Member Franco for reminding us that the board did take up some parking meter revenue, and I believe we are going to increase the revenue by around $95,000. That's based on that, but that's just unique parking rates in the lots. They're special programs. What we've been talking about here is the overall parking meter rate, the on-street parking meter rate going up by a quarter, and that would have generated $750,000. So we're not at this time including that in the revised plan. We had $1,850,000 in marijuana excise taxes that were also part of this non-property tax revenue commitment because of the scaling back of Netta's operations. And for those of you who don't know, they are going to be returning to curbside retail for adult use marijuana beginning on Tuesday, but on an extremely reduced basis. They are projecting that their sales are going down by 80% in that category. So obviously we've changed our marijuana excise tax revenue projection way down as a result. And then we are also planning on a $750,000 trash fee increase to account for recycling cost increases and to mitigate over time this increasing property tax subsidy on the fee, excuse me. So we are proposing a modest mid-year increase that will generate $375,000 in the trash fee, but much less than the $750,000. So again, all those lead to the $9.4 million reduction in our projection of local receipts. Then we move down to state aid. State aid, we are projecting to go down by $3.3 million. I really don't see the state coming through with the same state aid as that we had last year. And so that's our guess there. So then the other thing I want to talk about, and maybe we can, that's one of the issues I was going to talk about on the updates, federal funding. So our current budget, operating budget, does not rely on federal funds. Now, that's not to say we're not going to maximize our use of federal funds, but they are really to cover unanticipated expenses directly related to COVID. Now that could change, and I've been reading very carefully the tea leaves in Washington, which are very difficult to do, but I am hearing some slow consensus movement to a major state and local package. And if that happens, I believe that will change the whole nature of federal funding, and that we could be looking at using federal funding to fill our revenue hole. So we'll talk about that some more. And then also, we are complying with all of our free cash and reserve policies, especially related to the CIP in this budget. Even after we've changed, we have a reduced budget. We're still meeting all of our free cash and reserve policies, and we want to go over those with you today because they are discretionary. They're not built into any law or bylaw. They're our own policies, and they could, as we go over the budget policy issues, we would have to probably change formally our policies in order to do that. And then finally, I want to talk about that $2 million free cash allocation to the stabilization fund and how that works. Right now, that's in our budget. That is in our revised budget plan, doing that. So I wanted to make sure I was really clear about what are the major assumptions that contribute to this $13 million budget hole. And now I'd like just, Melissa, if you can spend and kind of go through these quickly, just review the local receipts and the state aid assumptions. And then if we have any questions, we can go on to them, and then we'll go to the main thing, which is the budget policy discussion.
Sure. So just this slide we had at the last meeting, and essentially just outlines kind of the budget prior to COVID, and then the three different scenarios that we looked at around reductions. And right now we're in this purple scenario 2 for planning purposes. And so I just wanted to provide a little bit more detail. I know the advisory committee was very interested in understanding.
FY21 revised. Is there double columns there or something?
Yep. So the revision here is essentially a property tax adjustment because we had borrowed more for debt than what we had planned. So there is a direct match on the expenditure side as a result of that. So just wanted to acknowledge that there was some change from our borrowing plan, but in terms of, I didn't want it to disrupt the change based on the revised budget, so I had to amend the base.
Okay, but that lower slide that says revenue source and it goes through the 5 revenue sources, there you see the changes, the local receipts and state aid, and there's 3 scenarios, and we believe the one in the middle, the one in the so-called purple, which generates $12.7 million, is where we still stand with the exception of that parking rate issue that the select board addressed the other night. So wanted to make sure everybody knows, that's where we're at. And then Melissa, why don't you just go in a little bit more detail?
Sure. So this is the local receipt, kind of a bit of a drill down on some of the categories under local receipts. And so you can see that, we didn't make the same assumption across the board for every category, but we definitely know that there are categories that are more sensitive to the current conditions than others. So, for example, motor vehicle excise right now, we have a 5% reduction, but for local option taxes, we've got a 50% reduction, so on and so forth. And so, parking meter fees, that's another category that's down below under departmental and other. And, I think that there are a few people on the advisory committee that I'll be meeting with this afternoon, where we can go even further into some of the details here on the different categories. But this is kind of a good summary of the assumptions that we made behind the local receipts numbers under scenario 2. And then the next slide here is just state aid. So essentially a 15% reduction to general government aid and Chapter 70, knowing that the school construction aid, that's from old SBA funds, so that shouldn't be changing, and not anticipating any major change in tax exemptions and education offsets.
Hey, Melissa, can I ask a question here? Right here?
Sure.
Going back to the previous slide, is that assuming that we'll have some recovery in the latter part of the fiscal year?
So I would say that for local option taxes, that anticipates that somewhere in the latter half of the year it will recover. I think in the optimistic scenario 1, I think we were anticipating a recovery in the first quarter. So that's essentially kind of how we looked at these kinds of things.
Okay. Thank you.
So then this slide just outlines some of the policy issues that I think Mel wanted to dive into a little bit deeper. First, starting with, I think we covered a little bit of the parking rates and the other fees at the outset of the meeting.
Melissa, I can go through this, but before we go further, is there any questions on the prior group of slides which tries to document the assumptions and the some of the rationale behind the projections? I think Melissa indicated that there is a small working group of the advisory committee that's helping drill down on these, which is good. But any other questions? I'm curious if anybody has any other information on state aid. We're hearing nothing, and we're just making some assumptions there. Asking for any town school partnership questions or input on the assumptions or the projections before we move on.
Just to say that that's very helpful. That the detail is very helpful, and it's as you know, we built our own model. A couple of people built the model that we used and came up with a parallel, really very similar set of conclusions.
Yep, this was Mel, Gina, and I kind of sitting down and kind of going through this. So I mean, I think there's definitely, you could have 5 different people come up with different numbers. At the end of the day, we know we're going to have to revise it again. We just need to make sure that whatever we're doing is flexible enough that we can adjust. So,
well, we actually had 8 people come up with numbers, and the average was pretty close with a couple of outliers, and we came up with something very similar to this.
Yeah, I think as more people do this in the state, we get more information, it'll become clearer, but probably not much before June 23rd, my guess. So I think Melissa's right. I think we're going to have to keep looking at these through the fall and adjust in November as necessary. But okay, then why don't we just go to the budget policy slides, various slides. Could you just go back, Melissa, to that prior slide? So we're going to take them one at a time, but I know I already addressed the funding of the override plan, but parking rates is an issue that's going to be on the select board agenda again, just generally talking about fee increases. I don't think I have to say anything unusual here. I mean, it's really a question about whether politically it would be an appropriate, politically and from public policy point of view, whether it would be appropriate to raise a general rate like this when commercial sector and other folks are suffering a great deal from the current economic crisis. And also, I think the similar kind of thing goes with the trash fees. Although in the trash fees, at least we are making some modest projection there. So I think those are issues sort of right in the middle of the select board policy discussions. I don't have any further slides on this. If we want to have any discussion about this, or I'm waiting for this policy discussion with the select board to help inform my feeling on it.
I'll just say, I think increasing parking meter rates, the select board didn't have that conversation, but that's predicated on the town starting to enforce the overnight parking ban and issue 2-hour violations. And I think, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I think there was some willingness on the select board to at some point, if not at the start of the fiscal year on July 1, shortly thereafter, to start to enforce 2-hour parking bans, issue citations, and enforce the overnight parking ban, which will bring us back to sort of level set us going forward. And then we can build on top of that with a potential rate increase.
Yeah, I think the consensus of the board is that we should return to the overnight parking ban and enforcement of meters much sooner than the start of the fiscal year. I think that is seen as going along with the so-called opening or reopening of the economy.
So we'll definitely have discussions of that, as well as this notion of whether we ought to address the parking rates at some point in fiscal 21, which would obviously have a direct impact on the fiscal 21 budget. So why don't we go to long-term liabilities, pension OPEB? This is a big one. So we just want to make sure we understand our pension funding plan is a formal legal plan. So each year we have to get state approval through our retirement board. Our retirement board, by the way, is also independent. So anything we do on pensions, we have to go through the retirement board. We can talk about that. But so this pension funding plan is not something that we can just kind of willy-nilly change around. It's a established plan that the state PARAC Commission, the state pension commission, approves every year. And so we'll talk about that. But just so everybody knows, we have an unfunded liability of $227.5 million. That's pretty huge. That's going to come to haunt us down the road if we don't fund it. And so we've begun to fund it. I think we've been in this funding schedule for at least 20 years. And we're only 57.1% funded. That's not bad, but I think some people think we were way up high or it's middle of the road. And we have over time tried to reduce our rate of assumption of investment earnings, because we do invest in securities and in the market for these long-term assets. And we've tried to continue to reduce that rate of assumption to be more conservative. So the point I would make about pension is, I know we've talked about seeing what we could do with the appropriation. I don't think there's something we're going to be able to do on this for fiscal 21. I think for fiscal 22, that's another story. And we've begun to ask through the retirement board, through their actuary, to help run some scenarios. So what would it mean if we, for example, changed the rate of assumption or extended our funding period of time? I think we're right now through fiscal year 30. And what would that generate? How would that change our funding schedule? My own feeling is that that's probably a fiscal 22 decision and not fiscal 21, but we can have some further discussion about that. And Gina Franconi is here, who is on the retirement board, and can talk about that dynamics. OPEBs, I think, are different. So OPEBs are called That's the acronym for other post-employment benefits. So what other things other than pension do we give our retirees? Well, we give them health insurance in Massachusetts. So that's a huge number. Another major liability of over $200 million. We're not even on a formal funding schedule yet. But we do put money in. We're putting $4.4 million into the OPEB fund, even though it's not a formal funding schedule yet. We're trying to put as much money in so we can even get to that point where we have a funding schedule. We're only 16% funded. We're not even at our annual required contribution yet. And again, same rate of return assumption. The thing I would say about OPEBs is there's no legal requirement for us to put money aside for this. But I think every prudent finance person understands that it's a question of time. And I can assure everyone that every year, this is a major issue in our audit. It's a major issue in our bond rating. Whenever we get our rating, we just got a revised AAA rating the other day, a few weeks ago, and this issue about OPEB was on the table. So I call it like a credit card. Gina helped me, create this analogy. Our OPEBs and our pension are obligations we have, and we got to start paying them down. And to the extent that we extend it, not unlike our mortgages, it's going to cost a lot more money down the road. But we have options here, and I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any thoughts about this one.
Mel, this is Susan. Can I just ask a quick question? What are some of the other municipalities at in terms of their percent funded, just roughly speaking?
A pension, we're in the middle of the road. So 57.1 is right around the average. OPEBs, I can tell you, we're way ahead of everybody. Maybe not AAA communities, and that's the issue. Is we just can't compare ourselves to everybody. We tend to compare ourselves with similarly situated AAA communities. And even in the AAA communities, I would say that 16% is high. It's further along than most. That's my guess. I'd ask Gina or anybody else who's been evaluating this how they feel about that. Answer that question.
Just to add to one thing about Mel's comment about us being in the middle, it's actually a little difficult to compare municipalities because of a number of things, one of which is the rate of return assumption. So there might be a municipality that says they're 80% funded, but they're using it on 8.5% rate of return assumption. Well, they're really not there. So it's very difficult to get true apples to apples when you're comparing municipalities.
So if I had to say, if I was going to ask, if you were asking me at this point, I would say, let's hold on the pension. Let's ask our actuary to generate some specific scenarios, but let's hold off that when we need it, if we need it in fiscal 22, but have a more serious discussion about OPEBs where, we've got $4.4 million in the budget for that. And so that's where how I would leave this one. And I will.
Yeah, sorry, this is Susan. Last comment. I cut my teeth. My very first assignment as a school committee member was on the OPEB, Rich Kelleher, and I don't know, it was hazing or something. Anyway, so I have fond memories of OPEB. So I think it would be helpful, Chris' comments notwithstanding, is just to get a sense of what some different assumptions would look like and where it would put us. I'm totally aware that that everyone uses slightly different assumptions, but we don't want to be way off one way or another. So even if we could just get some sense either from MMA or from actuaries or however as to what we could look at and still be within striking distance, that would be helpful.
Very good. All right, why don't we move to the next policy issue, which is free cash. So that's a big issue. I do want to remind everybody what free cash really is. I always say it's not free and it's not cash, but that's what we call it in Massachusetts. It's essentially our fund balance that the state looks at and says, okay, you say you have a fund balance of X, but we want to make sure, we're covering future liabilities or deficits in other revolving funds or whatever. And so the state takes sort of a haircut off of that number and then comes up with a number that they say is your fund balance that can be appropriated for the future. And so the town's policy, consistent with our AAA and conservative fiscal approaches, is to use that free cash only for one-time purposes, because it can fluctuate so much over time. And so what we use it basically to do is to cover our reserves and our capital improvement plan, and then some other things. And we some people know it, refer to it as the free cash waterfall, because we have an actual formula that says, okay, here's your free cash number, and here's how you're going to allocate it in the budget. Melissa, why don't you just go through the free cash waterfall, which is that table on the right?
Sure. So the first thing that we do is a piece of the reserve fund is funded with free cash. So 75% of the reserve fund, which is under the jurisdiction of the advisory committee, 75% of that is coming from operating funds, and 25% of that is coming from free cash. We are also looking at our fund balance, and so we're looking to not allocate the entirety of free cash, because free cash is part of fund balance. And then also, given the work of BFAC, we are looking to put some additional funds into the stabilization fund to help support our fund balance goals, which are 10% of unreserved fund balance. Then the next thing that we do is we look at the liability fund. So the liability fund and the reserve fund have the same targets. 1% of prior year net revenue is the target for both of those funds. And to the extent that the liability fund, if we have a settlement, we would need to replenish, and we use free cash to replenish.
So just so everybody knows, our liabilities at the town self-insures some of its obligations or its potential losses, and it's like an insurance policy. So we have to have a reserve for potential losses and settlements, legal settlements, and so on. So that's what the liability reserve is.
Then after the liability fund, the CIP. So the CIP has two different funding. Two different primary funding sources. The first is 6% of prior year net revenue, which is coming from that's operating revenue, and then the free cash is used to bring the CIP to a target of 7.5% of prior year net revenue. So that $4.2 million number in item number 4, that's what that represents. After those obligations are met, we look at the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and if the fund balance in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is below $5 million, then the policy says that 15% of what's available after meeting those first 4 obligations would go to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. After that obligation is met, then we have special use. So special use could be any of a number of reserves. In the past, we've used special use provide more funding to the pension system to try and help accelerate our plan, and then also used additional funding for if we have other funds like the Workers' Comp Trust Fund. If we find that is not sufficient to be meeting the town's needs, we sometimes would put additional free cash towards that. In this case, in fiscal 21, we had recommended that $4.1 million go entirely to the CIP. As everyone knows, the CIP has a lot of pressure on it, especially with some of the lease obligations that are commencing in fiscal 21 as well. This next slide here just gives a little bit of history of the 7.5% policy compared to what we've actually done in the CIP. So you can see our strategy with some of our local receipts that are sensitive to the economy, and I'm specifically thinking about building permits, is because those are kind of one time in nature in terms of some of the building permits. We're not going to build a Brookline Place every year. We're not going to build a BU theater every year. So we haven't budgeted for those in our building permits, and we've basically, that has allowed us to boost free cash, and we've used that increased funding for primarily CIP, but then also the pension and OPEB funding that we've been able to provide over the years. So you can see kind of how free cash has boosted the CIP beyond what the policy calls for, that 7.5%.
So thank you, Melissa. I think there's a really key chart here because you see the town has experienced positive free cash balances over the last few years, and we've allocated those not exclusively, but primarily to the capital projects. And, I think we all know why. I mean, we've been in this incredible mode of trying to expand school capacity, and then we put all the leases on the short-term leases in the capital improvement plan. So we really had to do that. But at this point, this is where I see a big area of potential availability for our problem is scaling back the CIP. We have, in our original budget, we didn't talk about this, Melissa, but we did scale back the CIP a little bit. I think maybe about $500,000. But this we're talking about, much more than that potentially in cash funded, including free cash CIP projects. So why don't you go back to the prior slide? So as we look at the free cash waterfall, I would have to say that number 4, 5, and number 4, 5, and 6, are ones that I think we really need to focus on. And so we've begun to start to look at our current CIP. I know the select board the other night started talking about a project that came before them. It's an old project. I think we ought to look at some old projects as well as the new ones that are being funded in 21. But I really do think that that's an area that would make sense for the town to cut back on. But that's going to be a problem because I know a lot of the costs are embedded in the leases for school space, especially that Maimonides lease, which is really a tough one. And I know the school committee is aware of that and trying to work on that. So why don't we talk about free cash and CIP a little bit and get some reactions?
I'll say I agree that the CIP allocation, both in 5, the sort of, in 4, the regular year over year, and then the special allocation under item 6 are ripe for review and thought. Of course, we need to look at the CIP itself and see what cutting $500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million does, and what projects we're actually preventing from going forward.
One of the things that we talked about in advisory was what projects need to be done in order to avoid future costs that would, versus what projects could be pushed off without incurring anything beyond the increase in cost of doing the project. So if you parse the list of projects in that way, I think that's one useful way of cutting of dividing up what might be postponed, what might not be spent, versus what needs to be spent.
I would add that in addition to that, people should be aware of the fact that many of our projects can't be cut back. One of the projects we dealt with on Tuesday was related to the cemetery, and that was paid out of the trust fund, to which we have very little, if any, control over. And so, I mean, there are a number of CIP expenditures in that category. And I think it's just important that people be aware of that so they don't think that there's a bigger piggy bank here than there really is.
I want to echo that comment because over the past few years, it just seems to me that there are more requests for CIP money than there has been CIP money available. And while we may have been in a school crunch, a lot of that obviously is done through debt exclusions and not really through the CIP. We put some operating stuff into the CIP, leases and what have you. But there's a lot of things that need to be done. And I'm with Bernard. I think that it's pretty risky to look at this as a huge sum of money that we can look towards.
Any other thoughts? How about from the school committee?
I think Helen is on from Capitol, but I'm not sure. It's hard to see.
I am, and we are certainly working together with the subcommittee of the Capitol subcommittee of the advisory committee to look at all the items on the CIP for this year and see where there might be some possibilities for delay or mostly delay, I think, of items. We certainly understand the predicament that we're all in, and we're partners here. So we are working on the leases and to see if there's any sort of ability to save some money in those. So that's where we're at this point.
Thanks, Helen. This is Mel again. I understand that the Capital Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee is taking a hard look along with our staff, and I think that's a good exercise, and I'm happy to have it reside there. I don't disagree with you, Cliff, about the magnitude of this, but I got to believe there's something in here, either existing, even old projects that are sitting around, but as well as proposed projects for fiscal 21. I think we're going to take a hard look at them. So leave it at that, I guess.
No, we fully expect that from the school department, that we need to look at everything. These are hard times.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is Susan. The only thing I would add is that last night, I think it was last night, when we were talking about the Brookline High School project at the advisory committee, one of the options for the overages is to reduce scope in the budget and put it into the CIP. And so, and it was, some of us tried to note multiple times that, you kind of pops up one place, you take it out of one place, it pops up somewhere else. So they just have to link that conversation when we are thinking about how we want to deal with the high school project, deferred maintenance or tap and gym or some of the other things. So we don't need to rehash that here. I just want to connect the conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Before we move on from this, I did want to mention that there was an item that has been raised before. I did not include it on the agenda today, and it has to do with the host community, the marijuana host community revenue. So as you know, that's revenue that comes, that's not general revenue, it's dedicated revenue. It has to go through the town meeting process, the appropriation process, but it can only be used for expenses that is related to the marijuana establishments we have. So I think you all know that where we spend most of our money is in Brookline Village on parking enforcement and police control and litter control and a lot of that community support. But we've also have a town meeting resolution that wants us to allocate a significant portion to racial equity programs, which I'm generally supportive of. I committed to doing that. It's a question of how much. Obviously, host community funds are going to go down, just like the excise tax revenue that we just talked about, marijuana tax revenue. But we're still going to get some, and we're looking at that budget again. There was one proposal that was made, I think, out of the Town Meeting Members Association that suggested that we really should strategize on how we use our host community agreement revenue, and that we should be more strategic about it and try to essentially use it for areas that we're funding in our budget that could be allocated or considered direct related to a marijuana establishment. There's a lot of tricky issues around that. I think all of you know host community agreement is in the paper all the time. The industry and legislators are always criticizing municipalities for abusing the host community agreements and the funding. So that's always a tricky one to go down. And also, I just don't think we have a lot of money there, and we have this commitment on racial equity funding. So I will and there's really probably not a lot of money there anyway. So I did want to raise that, and if anybody has different opinion about that, we can talk about that. But don't go to the next slide, Melissa, because I want to wrap up and have a little discussion about wrap up of this category. Anybody on host community agreement or anything else that we haven't talked about that would potentially represent a a revenue or budget capacity opportunity?
Yeah, I'm going to be unpopular and say the resolution from town meeting was a resolution, not an allocation of funds. And I think there's a fair amount of thought that needs to go into structuring a program so that we know what we're spending the money on. We would have hoped that those funds would be put in actually in FY22, not FY21, when some sort of a program was clearly in place with a way to administer it and understand what the results were from the money that was being spent. So I think that is money that we should take a look at and see, is that something that's appropriate to fund in 21 just because we're not ready to do anything with it?
Yeah. No, I agree, and that's something that we have to engage with the proponents of this fund to make sure that they understand that we're in an unusual situation and they need to have their program more structured and put together than it is currently. I think fiscal year 21 is probably when that could happen at the earliest.
So I would like, it would really be very helpful for me and Melissa as we're putting this budget together, knowing that we will still have discussions with our select board and get your input, but I'd really love to have a sense of whether this concept of a smoothing of some level that we don't take care of the budget hold by expenditure program reductions totally. Is that something that people want to promote and of what magnitude? For example, do we want to try to create a goal of trying to reduce that budget by a half or by a third or what have you, knowing that there are consequences of doing all these budget policies that we talked about. They're not free. So I would love to have a little bit of a general dialogue about whether this approach sounds good, or should we just suck it up and cut the budgets and hope for the best?
So I have a question. So far we've really focused primarily on revenue and ways to find cash to address expenses. I guess one thing I'm kind of curious as to whether or not the expense budgets that we're looking at are frankly as realistic as they need to be. I mean, we all talked in the spring and we all focused on the revenues and how the revenues were really, irrelevant from the budget book before. But it strikes me that some of those same comments could be applied to the expense categories. And I'm just curious if anyone has any thoughts about that, particularly the schools.
I think where the schools are really grappling is with, as we're moving into this time with COVID, we have significant impacts of COVID on the school and the school budget. And so at a time when we're talking about decrease in revenue and decrease in availability of funds for budget, in order for us to open our schools back in September, the reality is from a public health standpoint, a logistical standpoint, equity standpoint, an access standpoint, all of those things are going to cost more money. And so, I think that is, as we're talking about reality and, that is the reality that will be facing the schools. And so we are doing what we can and looking at all of those places where we can cut expenses. But I think that the schools are really here today to ask and to have this conversation of how we meet the reality of the situation that we're in.
So let me ask the question a different way. I mean, fiscal 20, we had a budget of roughly $117 million. I know that that's essentially pretty close to where things are ending up. And the projection for fiscal 21 was 123 million. Do you have, instead of that 123 million, do you have a new budget number that you're actually thinking about? Because that to me suggests that the whole, I mean, if it's going to go up, it could mean that the whole is bigger than what we're looking at entirely, or it means that things need to be shifted in a different way, or there are even more difficult conversations that need to happen than what people have been anticipating just looking at this page.
Julie, do you want to answer that, or?
Yes, Ben, feel free.
So, I mean, a couple things. One, the additional complexity of all this is we don't know yet what school will actually look like in the fall. Okay, meaning there'll be some additional expenses, like in areas that Julie just talked about. There likely is possible we could reduce expenses in places based on the model that we go forward with. That model isn't, as I don't think anyone would expect, that model isn't set yet. We're working on it. The budget the redeveloped budget we're working on right now, excuse me, I'm operating on this page that we're looking at right now, which is cutting $6.3 million. I'm not operating on, and trying to really take that number and with some, best, can't remember Mike Salmon's term about guesses, but I think of that term he uses.
Scientific wild ass guess.
There you go. Thank you. Of what, where we could potentially cut expenses, and that's in many ways positions, because we would have a different, service delivery model. So we're putting it together now. We're sharing it with the school committee on Wednesday. But we are operating now on building, Mariel and I are building the budget based on this page here.
And I'm sorry to kind of like take up the bandwidth here, but are there any deadlines looming that are going to force your hand here?
There's a very serious deadline, which you already got extended ones, which is May 30th, essentially a week from today. We have to notify the BEU about layoffs for next year. So that is, that's what we're working towards, and and since from the scenarios we were developing when we first were working with BEU, we got the latest information a week ago, exactly, which made those potential layoffs more severe, because the number we got a week ago was 6.3, obviously. So, but no, a week from today, essentially, we have to provide notices to those people who we think we may not have positions next year.
So one thing. I'm sorry. One last comment. One thing that I noticed, and I mentioned this the other day at the school finance committee meeting, is that the budget for FY20 and the target recommended budget for FY21 are essentially the same. It's like level funded, which suggests that if there were the ability to get some flexibility in terms of what drove that budgeted increase, by deferring, for periods of time or something like that, that you might not need to make any wholesale changes. What's the possibility of something like that happening?
Are you?
I want to jump in here and be specific, because one of the questions that we have is it sensible to, or have you had a chance to, or would you talked to the teachers union about recognizing that there's a trade-off between salary increases and benefits costs on the one hand that are contractually obligated, and on the other hand, preserving jobs. A relatively small concession on salaries and possibly on the portion of healthcare benefits that are paid by the town would go a long way to preserving jobs. And I realize that's something that is an emotional and difficult thing to contemplate on the part of the by union, but I wonder if that's a choice that might be offered to them.
So, frankly, we at this point are trying to work with our union partners on furloughs for FY20. And before we get to that conversation will, the conversation for FY21, sorry, will be sort of put in motion next week, with that May 30th deadline going forward, that sort of thing. But honestly, and what I hope we can talk about some today is the FY20 challenge we're facing, because that's what we're one of the ways we're trying to address our significant FY20 deficit is through that negotiations on furloughs, which are underway as of today, and are as they were on the town side complicated.
Can I just?
The other thing is, I want to get back to Mel's question, which was, what do we, in terms of trying to level things out? I think you could see from the recommendations that came out of the advisory committee subcommittee chairs that we are very much in favor of that. We would like to see some expenses that are postponable, CIP, for example, stabilization fund, and so forth, used to smooth things out. And we would also, of course, like to see to make sure that we have adequate reserve funds that are very promptly accessible. So some of that money perhaps might go into the advisory committees, the funds that are available to the advisory committee. But generally speaking, we were supportive of the approach that you're talking about.
Can I just go back to a point Ben made and about the deficit in current fiscal year, fiscal 20, or this notion that fiscal 21 is going to be more expensive because of COVID. And I think we have to be careful. We've got to talk about COVID, and then we got to talk about the economy that is frankly driven by COVID. But I don't think we're likely to get federal funding to deal with economic situations unless Congress does what they're been talking about, was really give us a lump of money and saying, okay, use this money to help your problems dealing with the economy. Right now, they're not saying that. They're saying, here's a $5.2 million. Over the next 2 years, you can use that for direct expenses related to COVID. So if the schools have to, expand their cleaning and sanitizing protocol, if the town has to buy more laptops to accommodate remote participation, if overtime expands because of whatever in the health department, those are the things that I think right now we're going to be able to get reimbursement for. We're prepared. I know, Mary Ellen, you put together, a proposal. Some of that I think is fine. Some of that I don't think is. But then again, we have the reserve fund. We've gone to the reserve fund, I think 3 or 4 times now. And so if the school department has expenses they think were emergency or unforeseen, I would encourage you to talk to the advisory committee.
Okay, so I think that's helpful as we're talking about, Mary Ellen, there are approximately 500 from the latest version we've seen. We have approximately $554,000 of expenses from FY20 that are attributable to COVID-19, additional custodians.
I mean, I think one piece that would be significantly helpful is if we stopped being forced to charge our cleaning and custodial cleaning and support to our operating budget and started moving and shifting those real expenses that truly are eligible to FEMA and MEMA to a special revenue account. That would be helpful because we're currently paying double time for our custodians to come in and clean, and that will happen until we either negotiate a suspension with AFSCME or we the governor removes the state of emergency, and he's not going to do that because that's key for FEMA MEMA money to come in. So I think that piece, that relief where we know we're going to apply for specific expenses, they're vetted by the town to remove those from our operating budget now, that would be very helpful. And I've put that list together, and that's pretty much food service preparing lunches, custodian doing cleaning, translation services that we've had to do that are all listed as part of the eligible. So just, that's a big chunk.
Yeah, I think we are prepared to do that. I think generally, I mean, we've got to go through the numbers, but I think we're prepared to take that off of budget and put it in a separate sort of fund submitted for reimbursement. But I do want to say that FEMA would not reimburse for double time. I think they reimburse for time and a half, and I'm not sure the state's going to reimburse for double time, or for example, if you didn't, you had a deficit in your MEAP funds, I'm not sure that they're just going to say, okay, that's COVID and we'll reimburse
I'm not.
you.
So I was very clear that I did not include BEAP funds at that point, this juncture. I'm putting things into buckets, like really what's eligible. We have loss of revenue in BEAP and food service and our rental facilities, which are economic based. Food service specifically, and need to separate, and totally appreciate that we need to separate the distinction of the labor time, supplies and materials in food service that are related to providing our low income families with free and reduced lunch from the labor we pay for because we didn't furlough employees, that those are two distinct costs and should be separated. And I totally get that, and I'm not going to argue that. But the fact of the matter is we have the operating budget needs to make up those revenue losses. And so we are trying to find different ways to do that. We froze our budget April 8th. We've got $2.4 million of open encumbrances we're shutting down, closing down, working on getting those closed out. Trying to defer a curriculum adoption payment to the next fiscal year with some help with Dave Giannakakis, and trying to really, squeeze, pennies from wherever to be able to balance those three funds. And I think the part of the relief I would like, and I guess I'm asking for, is to begin moving those that are going to be filed for anyway, to begin moving those now before the fiscal year ends, so I can really see that those, that we're going to have funds to get to a zero balance.
Carolyn, I would just say right now there's no place to, because we don't have guidance on how the state is going to be treating these expenses. Right now, we're assuming it's going to operate the way that 2015 worked when we had that no year, and then that was the strategy that was used, but we don't have anything that specifically that's how they intend on doing.
So then I think what would be helpful then is if I guess who is to, maybe I meet with Justin on a weekly basis and we go through and just make sure that we're constantly in agreement with what those costs are. So I have a running report of where those are, so that when that guidance comes in, that can be done quickly, or whenever it's going to be done. I don't, or that we all know that that's the amount our budget's going to be in deficit, because you don't have any guidance as to when or how to move it. Just, I want to be as transparent as possible, so that where there are agreements and we agree, that those continue to be documented, and when we end our budget in a deficit, that we all know that that amount everybody agrees to has to do with COVID expenses that are going to be submitted for FEMA. Like, just want to make sure we're all continue to be on the same page, because it's going to be a huge number for us, and it's big.
Beyond the $500,000 that you've already provided?
So potentially, because we're about to open our buildings for teachers to retrieve their belongings, to close our buildings for the summer and pack up our classrooms. So there's going to be another surge, or larger surge, of cleaning, more people coming in to clean buildings and then shutting them back down. We also can't do our summer cleaning until we get AFSCME to give us relief for example, and this is part of the other trouble we're having, is until we get AFSCME to give us relief, we can't actually do our summer cleaning that we would normally do, our deep clean of all of our buildings, because why would we do that at double time when we only usually do that at regular time? I mean, this clause and this clause was initially intended to sort of really incentivize employees who were coming in during a major weather event, and there was some danger, different type of danger, different type of safety precaution. Nobody ever contemplated that this would go on for more than 2 days. So we have some negotiations to do around that, but so anyway, I'm just looking for where can we get agreements, you know, how do we make sure we keep that agreement present, and we're going to have to continue to look for ways to reduce that, but I also want to make sure that people know that we're going to I get 3 options that are going to happen. I'm going to end up in a deficit, I'm going to show up at 0, or I'm going to have money left over. I don't know what that's going to be.
Yeah,
We'd like the last one.
not very realistic, but
But if we furloughed any people or we've canceled any expenditures, you know, there's, you know, blood coming off of somebody for that. And I just don't, that's not an experience I really want to have. And I think I just want people to know and understand what's happening and where the agreements are and where they're not.
Okay, well, we certainly will respond to your the thing you put together, and you're right. Justin is leading the charge for FEMA and CARES reimbursement, but we want you to be part of that, so that's fine. And I probably wouldn't want to talk any much more about collective bargaining or some of those trade-offs right at this meeting.
But I think the larger question for this group, and it doesn't need to be answered today, is to the extent that expenses are not reimbursable, how do we deal with them? You know, how do we, you know, if we do end up with a deficit caused by this or, you know, another decision, how are we treating that?
You're talking about FY20?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's keep our mind on 21 for the remainder of the meeting and see if we can, if there any other, before we move on, I do want to talk if there's any other input or thoughts about the overall approach, or I know every committee is going to go back and think about things. Susan, please.
Yeah, just the only thing I want to raise, and it does not have to be now either because it's, you know, we're 15 minutes left, but I do want to think a little bit more kind of holistically about how we make the decision about opening the buildings, because I think right now there's different people who have different ideas about what that's going to take in terms of not only equipment and supplies and where that goes from a budget point of view, but I think there's also just some important governance questions about the role that the public health department or the role that sort of our town sort of as a whole is going to play in making that decision, because it's potentially millions and millions of dollars at stake in terms of when we open the buildings versus, you know, fully, partially, or whatever. And frankly, there just isn't the expertise in the school department to be doing public health decisions like that, as it was the same was true at closing the school. So I'm not sure if the town school partnership is the right place to do that, but somewhere I think it's important for us to think about the governance questions on that decision specifically. We've had a lot of conversations at finance, and advisory has been there, but I'm mindful that Mel and Melissa, you haven't been there, select board hasn't been there. So as rich as the conversations have been with Cliff and Mike, it's just not a full conversation. So it would be helpful if we could just get a sense of runway on that, just where and how over the next, you know, couple of weeks can we have, or next week or so, can we have that conversation?
Sure, I'll try to answer that. It's a tough one. I see the phased reopening to be a lot similar to the ramp up, where there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pressure being brought on by groups or other communities who are doing certain things and saying, well, you know, our residents say, well, why aren't we doing that if so-and-so is doing that? So it's not just a public health challenge. I think it's a political challenge. Governance, I think, is a good way to put it. So far, you know, I think the select board really has been trying to be the group taking on some of these larger community-wide policy issues on COVID-19. Every week they do have an agenda item, and it seems like that we always fill it up with important issues around the town's response to COVID, whether it's using public parks, expanding streets to accommodate more pedestrians, and then maybe opening up our public buildings and the implications around that. So, Bernard, I don't want to speak for you if you think the board is willing to take on some of these COVID-19 policy issues.
Well, I think we're willing to discuss them, and they're important discussions for the board to take up.
So I think it would be helpful, just given some of the timing of this, if we can, again, I'm mindful of time right now, but either this coming Tuesday, your docket may be set, but I'm also just mindful that we not get ahead of you in terms of, the things that we're being asked to decide. So at any rate, in fairly short order, if we can get that docketed somehow, that would be helpful.
Well, I would suggest that you and Julie speak to Bernard and see if you can tee that up. We kind of are flexible on this agenda item. We call it update on COVID issues, and we're able to sort of put things in because things go so quickly. So I would encourage that.
Yeah, why don't we plan to do that next day or two? Actually, today's Friday. Today.
Yeah, today's Friday and Monday's a holiday. But yes, I think we're already having the conversation, so we're happy even just to start it next Tuesday if you want. But whenever you want, we can.
Yeah, you have to give us some guidance as to where you want to go, and so we can tee up the appropriate discussion at the select board.
I think we'll end this conversation, but just to let you know that we're having this similar conversations about when we're going to open up town hall to the public again, and and those are tough decisions. And I think what happens, unfortunately, is Newton and Boston and Cambridge open up, and our residents are saying, what about us? Or and so they're difficult conversations. They're primarily political decisions. There are a lot of it is political. Yeah. I think at this point, given the amount of time we had, Melissa, can you bring up the presentation again and then just go to the final couple slides? So no matter what we do, we're going to have to share go back to the allocation slide, the one prior to that. No matter what number it is, we're going to have to allocate it. And I think we had a discussion at our last meeting about the school town allocation formula, and I don't think we're going to be bound by any prior formulas. I think this is a unique situation, and we're going to see if we can't expedite it and do it in a fair manner, in a transparent manner. And so our position up to this point has been basically when we get to a number, we split it on a prorated basis based on the percentage of the budget that was submitted back in February. Is that accurate, Melissa? Is that essentially what we're proposing here?
Yes, but to the extent where we have categories that not take reductions, like non-appropriated, and at this point, unless we have some movement on premium split or a reduction based on potential position reduction, group health benefits. So to the extent that those categories can't absorb reductions, then the difference gets essentially split. For non-appropriated, it would be split 50-50. And then for that benefit reduction of $2.7 million, it's basically split based on the allocation of benefits, town and school, which you can see in the note down below there.
All right, so I don't know if we're going to be able to resolve this issue, but just to understand, there's a lot of different ways to slice the pie, and we're trying to do it in a straightforward and expeditious manner. But there are other ways, and we provide this slide with the notes underneath, so others can look at those and make their own judgment about that. And then the final slide is the timing and the process, and there's not much on the slide other than to say that we have the town November special town meeting. Typically, the town uses that as it relates to the budget to just do some tweaking. Usually it's, well, we got more state aid at the end than we anticipated, so we're going to allocate that or less, or some special issue. This year, I really believe that the compressed time frame is going to make the November special town meeting much more meaningful in relation to the budget. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So right now the timing is that I'm committing to submit a proposed budget on June 2nd, which is the two Tuesdays from now. At that.
Hey, Mel, you're cutting off.
Thank you. How is that now?
You got the two
Yep,
Tuesdays.
So in 2 Tuesdays from now, we're going to be submitting a budget proposal. I'm worried that there's not a lot of time. The select board will try to do what they do, the advisory committee, but we're really talking about 3 weeks or maybe less, since we have a combined reports document to get out to town meeting. So that's why I think November is going to be meaningful, because I think the town is going to need time. Even if we cut this problem by X, it's still going to result in a lot of reductions and other issues. And I just think that we're likely to be talking about those as we go to November. We have a lot more information to get. I think most communities are looking at using the fall to adjust their budget. Now, I know about this 1/12 budget option. I really don't think that applies to us, since we are having a town meeting. It's really about those places that can't have town meetings because of COVID. I don't like 1/12 budgets generally. I like to give it the best shot we got and then go to November. Want to have some discussion about that possibly, and how we look at annual town meeting and November special town meeting.
Val, just before we end, I know that we were focusing primarily on FY21, but just a lot of our school department conversations right now are really centered around FY20 and trying to work through the deficit that we have. And so we just want to fully understand, we will go to advisory to approach potential reserve fund transfers to ways to talk about the additional COVID expenses. But we want to understand if there is what the ability of the school department to access additional funds for this year might be, and if there are other avenues. One possible way would be at this upcoming town meeting, and if you had thoughts on that.
I think we were looking at the COVID-19 federal COVID-19 CARES Fund and any other federal funding that might be available to educational. We were told when we when the state gave us the Federal CARES Act presentation, they indicated that there may be other sources of federal funds, especially in the education area. But I think our commitment is to use the federal funding as much as we can to cover your COVID-19 direct related costs.
We do have additional costs, though, that are related to decrease in revenues, and so that's the place where a lot of those funds are for specific itemized versions and itemized things, and there are some expenses that we have that don't fall into those buckets. And so as we're trying to make decisions about cutting personnel, those funds do not help us to be able to avoid doing that. We're covering this year's expenses.
I think you go to the advisory committee. I think that's one place, although that's limited. We've already used not most, but a significant sum of that reserve fund. But the other one would be we need some guidance from the Department of Revenue to see if there's going to be any flexibility in moving some revenue capacity to FY21 from 20. Normally they close the books and that's it. You can't. But I don't know, Gina, do you have any sense of whether the DOR is going to allow some flexibility?
There is discussion about allowing revolving funds to level out for the next 3 years if they have a deficit in FY20, is to be able to recoup that over a 2 to 3 year period.
I think we're committing to sit down with Mary Ellen and Ben and really try to tackle this. I mean, I'm really focused on it that much, to be honest with you.
So can I ask about next steps? Are we going to have another meeting next week? And let me just, at least for my own benefit, I didn't find last week's meeting very productive. This week's meeting was better, but we went over a lot of the same discussion in terms of background, and so that tended to did everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and that so that I think that tended to truncate the ability to get into some of this stuff in great depth. And I know there's some folks probably online who have questions or points to make, and they're, just another week, there may be some additional ideas and thoughts that people have. I personally would like to see us continue doing this, at least this budget season.
Yeah.
I'm happy for that. I mean, the bottom line is somebody's got to start somewhere, and the Town Administrator Act puts that in my shoes, and I'm prepared to do that. And but it doesn't end there. It begins, and what I'm trying to do is generate as much understanding, ideas, consensus, thoughts from the decision makers, so that my budget proposal that comes out isn't crazy, and we don't waste a lot of time on it, and it represents the policy of the town. That's easier said than done. So ultimately, one way or the other, I'm going to submit a proposal on June 2nd. But to meet next week is fine, and then to meet going forward is okay by me too. I think it's a good idea.
Okay, so let's meet next time, same place.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Have a happy holiday.
Happy Memorial Day to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mel and Melissa and Gina, for pulling this together.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.